When we think about the Middle Ages, most people picture knights, castles, and epic battles. But if you really want to understand daily life in medieval times, there's one subject that's both shocking and hilarious: toilets. Yes, the humble act of going to the bathroom was a lot about technology, hygiene, social class, and even human ingenuity. And trust me, it's far more interesting and messier than you might think. Let's start with the basics. In modern life, toilets are everywhere. At home, in offices, restaurants, and even on airplanes. But in medieval Europe, toilet habits were dictated by architecture, geography, and social status. For kings and queens, a throne might be literally a stone seat with a hole over a chute, but for peasants, going to the bathroom could mean braving the fields, a ditch, or a river. And nobody had toilet paper as we know it today. Leaves, rags, or even moss were the norm. Imagine explaining that to your average 21st century person. The fascination with medieval toilets isn't just gross-out humor. It tells us about how society managed waste, disease, and privacy. In castles, for instance, you had something called a garderobe. This was essentially a small room or protruding tower where nobles could sit comfortably, and gravity would do the rest, sending waste down the chute and sometimes directly into the moat. Yes, literally into the water surrounding the castle, so if you were swimming, you might want to check twice where you're diving. Fun fact, garderobes were often positioned over cold air shafts, so they doubled as early refrigerators for certain foods. Multi-purpose, medieval style. Meanwhile, the common people had a very different experience. Villagers often relied on simple pits, ditches, or the nearest river. In towns, public conveniences existed, but they were basic and often shared by dozens of people. Waste disposal was a constant problem. Night soil collectors, people whose job was to empty chamber pots at night, were crucial for keeping streets from turning into rivers of, well, human output. Not glamorous, but absolutely necessary. Even the smells of the Middle Ages shaped social life. Cities were notorious for their stench. Open sewers, livestock roaming the streets, and minimal washing created a pungent environment. Some chroniclers claimed that the smell could knock you off your feet. It's no wonder that public baths and washing rituals, though rare by modern standards, were socially and medically important. Hygiene wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was literally about survival. What makes medieval toilets especially fascinating is how culture, superstition, and human creativity intersected with biology. For instance, people believed that sitting on certain stones could ward off disease, or that witches could curse you through improper waste disposal. And of course, there were endless taboos, etiquette rules, and practical inventions designed to make life a little easier and less smelly. In short, toilets in the Middle Ages were far more than just a necessity. They reflected social hierarchy, technology, and the daily struggle between convenience and cleanliness. They were at once clever, disgusting, funny, and essential. Understanding them gives us a surprising window into medieval life, because no matter how brave you were in battle or refined in court, everyone had to deal with the same basic human needs. In the next chapter, we'll dive deeper into the world of castles and royal toilets, exploring the garderobe, latrines, and other ingenious medieval inventions designed for kings, queens, and the occasional royal pet. You'll see that when it comes to toilets, the Middle Ages were anything but boring. When it comes to medieval toilets, castles were the penthouses of the poop world. While peasants braved ditches and rivers, royalty and nobility had the luxury of a garderobe, a specially designed toilet that combined privacy, efficiency, and, occasionally, ingenuity bordering on genius. Today, the word garderobe might sound fancy, like some medieval spa treatment, but in reality, it was the aristocrat's way of saying, "We have to poop, but let's do it with style." The classic garderobe was a small room or a niche in the castle, often jutting out over the castle wall or moat. A stone seat with a hole allowed the waste to drop straight down, sometimes into a pit or directly into the water below. Some castles were built with multiple garderobes, strategically positioned so that every wing, tower, or living quarter had convenient access. And yes, the moat sometimes doubled as a medieval sewage system, though swimmers probably didn't appreciate it. Some garderobes were surprisingly sophisticated. They featured wooden seats, sometimes with carved initials or heraldic symbols, showing that even toilet design reflected status and artistry. Certain garderobes had ventilation shafts, an early form of odor control, while others incorporated waste chutes, leading to underground pits, making cleanup slightly less gruesome. The engineering was rudimentary by modern standards, but for the 12th or 13th century, it was impressive. Some historians even argue that well-maintained garderobes may have helped prevent disease outbreaks among the castle elite, though this was probably more luck than design. Privacy was another consideration. In a time when communal living was common, the castle garderobe offered a rare moment of solitude. A noble might spend several minutes perched on the stone throne, perhaps reading a manuscript, chatting with a trusted advisor, or simply enjoying a moment of peace. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of scrolling through your phone, except your only apps were prayers, etiquette, and maybe some gossip. Royal pets sometimes had their own designated spots too. In some castles, dogs or even exotic animals had small waste areas, keeping the castle cleaner and avoiding mix-ups between human and animal waste, a practical solution, if not the most glamorous one. Interestingly, some castles had shared latrine systems, which were precursors to modern public restrooms. Multiple garderobes would empty into the same pit or river, sometimes connected by wooden planks, so attendants could move waste safely without falling in. In larger castles, the waste might be collected and used as fertilizer for gardens, blending hygiene with early agricultural ingenuity. Talk about recycling before it was cool. The social hierarchy of castle toilets was strict. Nobles had private garderobes, servants and guards might use separate latrines, often located outside the main walls. Rules governed etiquette. You didn't just walk in uninvited, and certain gestures or manners were expected. The castle toilet was a reflection of order, privilege, and, surprisingly, engineering skill. Even the materials used were noteworthy. While wood and stone were standard, some luxury garderobes incorporated leather pads, cushions, or even decorative tiles. In certain palaces, wealthy families went to great lengths to make toilets aesthetically pleasing, proving that medieval people understood comfort and status extended to every aspect of life, including where you did your business. In conclusion, the castle privy was a remarkable fusion of function, status, and early engineering. It shows that even in an era often thought of as dark or primitive, humans were innovating ways to solve basic needs creatively. Castles were not just fortresses, they were hubs of medieval technology, and that included toilets. Understanding garderobes gives us a window into the daily lives of kings and queens, revealing how the elite managed hygiene, privacy, and even humor in ways that continue to surprise historians today. In the next chapter, we'll explore the toilets of ordinary people, peasants, villagers, and townsfolk who had to manage waste without moats, stone seats, or ventilation shafts. Prepare for a journey through ditches, rivers, and the ingenious and sometimes disgusting solutions that kept medieval communities functioning. While nobles enjoyed their guardrobes perched over moats, the average medieval peasant had a much less glamorous experience when it came to going to the bathroom. In villages and towns, life was simple, hard, and often dirty, and toilet habits were no exception. Understanding how ordinary people managed waste not only gives us insight into daily life, but also into disease, hygiene, and social organization in the Middle Ages. Most peasants did not have private toilets inside their homes. Instead, they relied on simple pits, ditches, or nearby fields. A common solution was the cesspit, essentially a hole dug in the ground near the home, sometimes lined with stones. These pits were emptied occasionally, though not always on a schedule, meaning that hygiene standards were, let's say, inconsistent. In winter, frozen ground made digging impossible, so many villagers simply deposited waste outside or in designated communal areas. In towns, things were even more complicated. Streets were often open sewers, lined with waste from homes, animals, and marketplaces. Rivers and streams doubled as both water sources and waste disposal channels. Unfortunately, this meant that waterborne diseases, like dysentery and cholera, were rampant long before scientists understood germs. Cities smelled terrible, and residents developed strategies to avoid the worst of it, such as using elevated walkways or avoiding certain areas during peak stench hours. A unique figure in medieval sanitation was the night soil collector. These workers, often hired by towns or wealthy landowners, collected human waste from chamber pots and cesspits during the night. Their work was considered repulsive, dangerous, and socially low status, yet absolutely essential for preventing streets from becoming uninhabitable. Night soil collectors often sold the waste as fertilizer, recycling it for agriculture, a surprisingly practical and sustainable approach, though probably not something you'd want on your salad. In rural villages, open defecation in fields or forests was common. While it may sound crude to modern ears, peasants were practical. Waste was deposited where it could decompose naturally and even provide nutrients for crops. It was a system built on necessity, efficiency, and a deep understanding of the natural environment. Sometimes villagers designated specific toilet fields to minimize disease spread and maintain some sense of order. Privacy was minimal. Peasants might build small wooden structures, a kind of crude out house, or simply squat behind a bush. Etiquette varied. Families tolerated little intrusion, but communal areas required cooperation and modesty. In some regions, a neighborly signal might indicate that the toilet area was occupied, akin to a medieval "do not disturb" sign. Toilet paper, not a thing. Instead, people used leaves, moss, straw, rags, or even corn cobs. In colder regions, snow was sometimes pressed into service. The concept of cleanliness was different. The goal was practicality, not hygiene as we know it today. Bathing was infrequent, and hand washing after using the toilet was rare, contributing to the spread of disease. But it's important to remember that they did the best with what they had. Interestingly, many peasant toilets had a secondary function. Waste was valuable as fertilizer, and strategic disposal helped crops grow. Villagers often developed informal systems to manage this resource, showing that even in rudimentary conditions, medieval people understood waste management better than we might think. There was an entire ecology of human ingenuity built around necessity, smell, and survival. Finally, superstition played a role. Some believed that improper disposal could attract spirits, cause curses, or even make livestock sick. Rituals, prayers, or charms were sometimes placed near latrines or pits to ward off evil. While humorous to modern audiences, these beliefs shaped behavior and community norms, blending practical waste management with cultural psychology. In conclusion, the peasant's toilet experience was messy, creative, and socially complex. Fields, pits, rivers, and night soil collectors were all part of a system designed to cope with life before plumbing, sewage treatment, or sanitation science. While not glamorous, this system reveals a surprising amount about medieval ingenuity, community organization, and human adaptation. In the next chapter, we'll explore public toilets and bathhouses, where urban dwellers sought both hygiene and social interaction because even in the Middle Ages, people needed more than just a pit in the ground to navigate daily life. While castles offered garderobes and villages relied on fields, the medieval city was a whole different challenge when it came to toilets and hygiene. Crowded streets, open sewers, and the constant flow of people created both logistical and olfactory dilemmas. To address this, some cities developed early forms of public toilets, while bathhouses became centers not only for cleanliness, but also for social interaction, gossip, and entertainment. In medieval Europe, public latrines were surprisingly common in towns and cities. They were often built over rivers or streams, allowing waste to be carried away with flowing water. In places like Paris and London, communal toilets existed near marketplaces or along busy streets. These were mostly simple wooden structures with long benches punctuated by holes, so multiple people could sit side by side because medieval privacy standards were, let's say, different from ours. A person using a public toilet might strike up a conversation, discuss politics, or share the latest gossip, making these facilities hubs of social life as well as hygiene. Water management was key. Cities with access to rivers or streams could maintain rudimentary waste removal systems, while those without faced severe problems. In some German towns, stone channels carried both rainwater and human waste, helping reduce the risk of disease, but not eliminating the overwhelming stench. In Venice, the canals themselves served a dual purpose, transportation and waste disposal, a fact that might make modern visitors think twice about hopping in a gondola. Bathhouses were another important aspect of medieval urban hygiene. While most people think bathing was rare, communal bathhouses were surprisingly popular, especially in the 12th and 13th centuries. These bathhouses offered heated water, sometimes divided by gender or social class. Patrons could soak, wash, and even get minor medical treatments because bathing was believed to have health benefits, from clearing the skin to balancing bodily humors. Some bathhouses were lavish, with tiled pools, wooden changing rooms, and attendants who helped maintain the facilities. Others were simple, steamy rooms with tubs or basins, but the concept of communal bathing was consistent, a place to clean, relax, and socialize. Interestingly, bathhouses and public toilets often intersected in both function and cultural perception. Using these facilities could be seen as a social ritual, a way to network, and even a site of entertainment or scandal. People exchanged news, discussed trades, and sometimes engaged in flirtation or intrigue. Chroniclers occasionally reported on disputes or humorous incidents in bathhouses, suggesting that these locations were as much about community interaction as hygiene. However, public sanitation was far from perfect. Waste management relied heavily on human labor, including night soil collectors who emptied latrines and cesspits. Diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid spread easily in crowded urban areas, exacerbated by open sewers and inconsistent cleaning practices. Municipal authorities often tried to enforce cleanliness with local ordinances rules about throwing waste in the streets, the construction of latrines, and the removal of refuse, but enforcement varied widely. Cities faced constant challenges, balancing practicality, economics, and public health in a pre-modern environment. Superstition again played a role. Some communities believed that poorly maintained toilets could attract evil spirits or curses. Talismans, charms, and prayers were sometimes placed near communal facilities to protect users and ward off disease. While these practices may seem quaint today, they reflect the medieval attempt to blend practicality with belief systems, showing how people navigated uncertainty and danger in daily life. Bathhouses, however, were not without controversy. Certain religious authorities criticized them for moral reasons, fearing that communal bathing could lead to impropriety or illicit encounters. This tension highlights a broader societal struggle, balancing hygiene, health, and social interaction with cultural and religious norms. Yet despite criticism, bathhouses remained a vital part of urban life, providing both cleanliness and a rare form of leisure and entertainment in a world without modern conveniences. In conclusion, public toilets and bathhouses reveal how medieval cities innovated to meet the challenges of urban life. They were spaces of hygiene, socialization, and even entertainment, reflecting both the ingenuity and the limitations of the era. From rivers carrying waste to steamy communal baths, medieval urban sanitation shows a fascinating blend of practicality, culture, and human adaptation. In the next chapter, we will explore chamber pots, night soil collectors, and the people who managed waste behind the scenes, shedding light on the often overlooked but essential labor that kept medieval communities functioning. If castles had garderobes and cities had public latrines, the medieval chamber pot was the unsung hero of everyday life. Used by peasants, townsfolk, and even nobility, the chamber pot was a simple but essential tool, a portable container for a human waste, usually made from ceramic, metal, or even wood. It was the medieval version of just keep this here until morning, but with all the challenges that come from a time without flush systems or sanitation engineering. Chamber pots were often kept under beds, in cabinets, or behind screens. Using one required care, discretion, and sometimes courage, especially in households where multiple people shared the same room. Some wealthy households even had ornately decorated chamber pots, with family crests or colorful glazes a nod to status, because even waste containers could be symbols of social hierarchy. Of course, once a chamber pot was full, it had to be emptied, and that's where night soil collectors came in. These brave individuals were responsible for removing human waste from homes, streets, and latrines, often working under the cover of darkness to avoid both smell and social stigma. Their job was unpleasant by modern standards, but crucial. Without them, cities would have quickly become uninhabitable, and disease would spread even faster. Night soil collectors operated with impressive efficiency. They carried buckets, carts, or wheelbarrows, navigating narrow streets and busy marketplaces. In some towns, they had designated routes and schedules, ensuring that waste from chamber pots, garderobes, and public latrines was collected and transported to disposal or reuse sites. Their work also had a second function. The collected human waste was sold as fertilizer to farmers outside the city. In this sense, night soil collectors were not just sanitation workers, they were part of an early recycling system, turning human byproducts into agricultural gold. The life of a night soil collector was difficult and dangerous. Exposure to human waste meant constant risk of disease, and the smell was nearly unbearable. Yet their contribution was critical, and in some regions, they formed informal guilds or communities, sharing techniques, tools, and survival strategies. Chroniclers sometimes describe them with a mix of disdain and admiration, a profession despised for its odor, but respected for its necessity. Chamber pots themselves varied widely depending on social class. A noble might have a ceramic pot with a lid, discreetly tucked in a private chamber, while peasants used basic wooden or clay pots. Some households even had designated servants to empty and clean the pots regularly. In urban areas, landlords or city officials sometimes required tenants to dispose of chamber pot contents at specific times or designated locations to prevent streets from becoming dangerously filthy. Interestingly, the design of chamber pots sometimes included practical innovations. Some had spouts for easier pouring, handles for safer transport, or even double compartments to separate liquid and solid waste. While modest by today's standards, these innovations demonstrate that medieval people were ingenious problem solvers, finding ways to manage the daily necessities of life in a world without plumbing or modern sanitation. Hygiene was a constant concern. People often rinsed chamber pots with water, ash, or even urine, which was believed to have disinfectant properties. Soap was rare, so cleanliness was relative. But medieval people did understand the importance of regular emptying and cleaning, especially in households where illness could spread quickly. Chamber pots, night soil collectors, and other sanitation measures were essential to public health, long before germ theory or modern medicine. Finally, the social and cultural impact of chamber pots on waste collectors cannot be overstated. They reveal a hidden infrastructure supporting daily life, a network of labor, etiquette, and ingenuity that allowed communities to function. While these details might make us laugh, cringe, or shake our heads today, they highlight the resourcefulness and resilience of medieval society, adapting to challenges with creativity, organization, and sometimes humor. In conclusion, chamber pots and night soil collectors were far more than crude tools or unpleasant jobs. They were the backbone of medieval sanitation, ensuring that cities, towns, and households could operate despite the obvious challenges. Their story is a fascinating glimpse into the intersection of necessity, labor, and innovation in a world before modern toilets. In the next chapter, we'll explore the smells of the Middle Ages, why cities reeked, and how people coped with odors that could literally knock you off your feet. If you've ever thought that medieval life was all knights, castles, and heroic battles, think again. One of the most defining and unforgettable features of the Middle Ages was the smell. Cities reeked, streets were rivers of waste, livestock roamed freely, and personal hygiene was limited at best. Understanding the odors of the era isn't just a funny anecdote, it gives us insight into health, technology, social norms, and survival. Let's start with cities. Urban areas were crowded, and waste disposal was primitive. Human excrement, animal dung, and garbage often shared the same streets. Open sewers were common, carrying waste from homes and markets into rivers. These rivers, in turn, were sometimes sources of drinking water, which meant that disease spread easily, especially waterborne illnesses like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. The stench was so strong that travelers and chroniclers often commented on it, describing it as enough to make a person gag or faint. Imagine walking through a medieval city during a summer heat wave. Not pleasant. Personal hygiene was sporadic. While nobles might bathe occasionally in private tubs or use perfumed waters, the average person bathed infrequently, perhaps a few times per year. Bathing culture varied by region. In Northern Europe, cold winters made frequent bathing uncomfortable, whereas in Southern Europe, communal bathhouses allowed more regular washing. Even then, these baths were often mixed-use social spaces, and hygiene was not the only motivation. Entertainment, gossip, and networking played an equally important role. The combination of poor urban sanitation and infrequent bathing meant that medieval odors were omnipresent. People relied on perfumes, scented oils, and herbs to mask smells, especially among the elite. Lavender, rosemary, and rose water were popular, and some nobles even carried handkerchiefs soaked in fragrances to mitigate odors during public appearances. Unfortunately, these measures were cosmetic at best, addressing the symptom rather than the root cause. Livestock added to the challenge. Cows, pigs, chickens, and horses roamed the streets, and their waste mixed with human excrement. Markets, slaughterhouses, and stables contributed to the pervasive smell, creating a multi-layered olfactory assault. Sanitation workers and night soil collectors had a particularly tough job, navigating these streets while emptying chamber pots and cesspits under challenging conditions. Interestingly, the odors themselves had practical implications. People learned to avoid certain areas or times of day to reduce exposure. Some cities developed ordinances requiring households to remove waste at specific times, and rules existed about dumping refuse into streets or rivers. Even without germ theory, there was a practical understanding that waste could cause sickness, and behaviors evolved accordingly. Superstition and cultural beliefs also influenced hygiene. Some thought that bad smells were miasmas, or poisonous vapors, capable of spreading disease. Others believed that foul odors could attract evil spirits or misfortune. As a result, rituals, charms, and herbal mixtures were used near latrines, doorways, and streets, blending superstition with practical sanitation efforts. It's a fascinating mix of observation, logic, and folklore, humans trying to survive using whatever tools they had. Even inside homes, smells were pervasive. Chamber pots emitted odors that required constant attention, emptying, washing, and sometimes masking with herbs or ash. Kitchens, fires, and cooking smells mingled with waste odors, creating a pungent atmosphere. In multi-family dwellings, the challenge multiplied. Privacy, cleanliness, and social etiquette had to be balanced against the realities of smell and limited space. Despite these challenges, medieval people adapted remarkably well. They developed clever engineering solutions, from garderobes over moats to drainage channels in streets, and cultural norms around waste disposal and hygiene. They also created early versions of sanitation labor networks, with night soil collectors and city ordinances maintaining order. While modern noses might recoil, these strategies were effective enough to allow dense populations to survive and thrive. In conclusion, the smells of the Middle Ages were not just unpleasant, they were a window into medieval life, revealing the intersection of hygiene, disease, social norms, superstition, and human ingenuity. They show that survival depended not only on food, shelter, and defense, but also on managing one of the most unavoidable aspects of life, human waste. In the next chapter, we will dive into disease, hygiene, and superstition, exploring how the medieval approach to toilets and sanitation influenced public health and why some of their methods were surprisingly effective. If there's one thing that truly shaped medieval life, it was the deadly combination of poor hygiene and superstition. Toilets, latrines, cesspits, and open streets weren't just inconvenient, they were potential sources of disease, mystery, and fear. Understanding how people navigated this world gives us an eye-opening perspective on survival, human behavior, and the ingenuity of the Middle Ages. Let's start with disease. Without germ theory or modern sanitation, people didn't fully understand how illnesses spread. but they knew there was a connection between filth and sickness. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and plague were constant threats, and contaminated water sources often made public toilets a deadly game. Rivers served both as drinking water and as waste disposal systems, meaning that one sip could lead to illness or worse. Hygiene practices varied widely by class and region. Nobles might bathe occasionally, wash hands with scented water, or use perfumed cloths, while peasants relied on river water, rainwater, or occasional communal baths. Soap was scarce, and clean water was a luxury. Still, medieval people developed practical habits, like separating waste from food preparation areas, elevating beds above floor level, and emptying chamber pots regularly. These measures, although primitive, were surprisingly effective at reducing some risks. Superstition played a major role in medieval sanitation. People believed that miasmas, or poisonous vapors, could carry disease, and foul odors were seen as dangerous. Some even thought that witches or evil spirits could curse them through improperly disposed waste. Talismans, charms, and prayers were often placed near toilets, cesspits, or latrines to ward off both supernatural and natural threats. While modern science laughs at the idea of smelly air as disease, these beliefs shaped behavior, encouraging people to manage waste more conscientiously than they might otherwise have done. Certain diseases had specific associations with toilet practices. Dysentery, caused by contaminated water or food, was rampant in crowded towns with open sewers. Typhoid outbreaks often coincided with improper disposal of chamber pot contents. During plague epidemics, human waste was sometimes blamed, and cities increased sanitation efforts, building new latrines, draining cesspits, or regulating waste disposal. Even without understanding microbes, medieval communities developed proto-public health strategies out of necessity. Medieval medicine also intersected with sanitation. Physicians advised bathing, hand-washing, and separating waste from living areas, advice that resonates today. Herbal remedies and disinfectants, such as vinegar, rosemary, and ashes, were used to reduce odors and bacterial growth. People sometimes boiled water, filtered liquids, or even burned fragrant herbs to purify rooms. While the science wasn't perfect, the combination of observation, experience, and superstition created surprisingly practical hygiene strategies. Social norms were also intertwined with toilet hygiene. Using a chamber pot or public latrine incorrectly could be considered a breach of etiquette, and communities often had rules about where and when waste could be disposed of. Violating these norms could lead to fines, public shaming, or even accusations of witchcraft in extreme cases. The medieval approach to toilets was therefore a mix of practicality, morality, and fear, creating a complex social system around something that might seem trivial today. Interestingly, the fear of contamination and obsession with cleanliness influenced architecture and city planning. Streets were designed with drainage in mind, cesspits were lined with stones, and some castles had complex garderobe systems with chutes leading to pits or moats. Even the placement of homes, kitchens, and stables considered the flow of waste, smells, and water, showing that sanitation influenced urban design centuries before modern plumbing. Finally, superstition, disease, and hygiene intersected in unique cultural practices. In some regions, people believed that placing charms near waste could prevent illness or attract good fortune. Festivals, rituals, and prayers often coincided with seasonal cleaning, latrine emptying, or river waste disposal. These practices, while mystical in appearance, reinforced communal health and awareness, creating an early system of sanitation management wrapped in folklore. In conclusion, disease, hygiene, and superstition were inseparable from medieval toilets. From deadly pathogens to mystical charms, the ways people managed waste reflect the tension between fear, innovation, and survival. Understanding this dynamic gives us insight into human resilience and ingenuity, revealing how medieval communities faced one of life's most unavoidable challenges: staying alive and relatively clean in a world without modern plumbing. In the next chapter, we'll explore funny toilet customs and etiquette, revealing how humor, creativity, and social rules made bathroom life in the Middle Ages both fascinating and surprisingly civilized. When we talk about medieval toilets, it's easy to focus on the grim, smelly, and dangerous aspects of sanitation. But the Middle Ages were also a time of humor, creativity, and social etiquette, even in the bathroom. Understanding these customs gives us a fascinating glimpse into medieval life, how people laughed, interacted, and navigated one of the most unavoidable human activities with ingenuity and sometimes absurdity. Let's start with etiquette. Even in a world of chamber pots, guardrabes, and open ditches, there were rules about toilet behavior. Nobles had private guardrabes, and using them required discretion and a certain sense of decorum. For example, a visitor never entered the toilet area uninvited, and certain gestures or modesty practices were expected. It was considered rude to discuss what happened inside the chamber pot, and nobles often treated their private time as an extension of courtly etiquette. In towns and cities, public latrines also had unwritten rules. Communal benches allowed multiple people to sit side by side, often facing each other. Conversation was common, discussing politics, trade, or the latest gossip, but some topics were strictly off limits. Hygiene and social interaction blended in strange, practical, and sometimes hilarious ways. For example, people might exchange tips on which streets were cleaner, or warn newcomers about particularly smelly latrines, turning shared suffering into a form of community bonding. Humor played a surprisingly big role. Satirical writings, poems, and chronicles of the Middle Ages often made fun of toilet habits, odors, and mishaps. Court jesters and storytellers included jokes about chamber pots, accidents, and smelly streets. Humor served a social purpose. It humanized daily struggles and allowed people to cope with one of the more unpleasant aspects of life. Imagine medieval memes, but with poop as the punchline. Certain customs were downright peculiar. In some regions, families or communities had toilet games or rituals designed to make a necessary task less tedious. For instance, some chronicles describe competitions to see who could empty a chamber pot fastest, or who could avoid spilling waste while transporting it to the street or river. These rituals blended practicality with entertainment, showing that medieval people could find levity even in the messiest situations. The elites sometimes had even more elaborate and amusing customs. Some nobles decorated chamber pots with intricate carvings or painted scenes, turning an everyday object into a conversation piece. Others had servants announce when the noble was using the toilet, not only for privacy, but also to add a touch of ceremony to the act. Humor, pageantry, and ritual mixed in ways that might seem absurd today, but made perfect sense in a culture that valued hierarchy, propriety, and social display. Social rules extended beyond etiquette. Superstitions and folklore influenced toilet behavior. Some people believed that talking while using the toilet could invite spirits, while others thought that certain objects or charms should be placed nearby to prevent illness or attract fortune. Toilet practices were often intertwined with magical beliefs, making even simple acts both functional and culturally meaningful. Even in rural villages, humor and custom played a role. Children were often taught playful rhymes or songs about toilet activities, sometimes as part of moral lessons, sometimes just for entertainment. Adults, meanwhile, might use humor to lighten the unpleasantness of chores, like emptying chamber pots, cleaning latrines, or transporting night soil. This blending of practicality, superstition, and comedy highlights the creative resilience of medieval communities. In conclusion, funny toilet customs and etiquette show that medieval people approached even the most basic human needs with a blend of pragmatism, humor, and social awareness. Whether in the castle, city, or village, toilets were not just functional, they were social spaces, sources of entertainment, and reflections of cultural norms. Understanding these customs reminds us that life in the Middle Ages was messy, challenging, and sometimes stinky, but it was also inventive, human, and surprisingly relatable. In the next chapter, we'll compare toilet practices across different cultures, looking at Europe, the Islamic world, and Asia, revealing the diversity and creativity of human approaches to one of life's most universal necessities. While European medieval toilets often involved garderobes, chamber pots, or open pits, other parts of the world had very different approaches to sanitation and hygiene. Comparing these practices gives us a fascinating perspective on how geography, climate, technology, and culture shape the most basic human necessity, going to the bathroom. Let's start with the Islamic world. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba in the medieval period had surprisingly advanced sanitation systems. Public bathhouses, known as hammams, were widespread, and not just for hygiene, they were social hubs, much like European bathhouses, but often more integrated into city planning. Waste disposal in Islamic cities also involved rudimentary plumbing systems, with some streets and buildings equipped with drainage channels that carried liquid waste away from homes. Scholars and travelers noted the relative cleanliness of these cities, emphasizing that public health and religious ritual often went hand in hand. For example, Islam emphasizes ablution before prayer, which encouraged regular washing and indirectly supported better hygiene practices. In China, sanitation systems were even more sophisticated in some cities. During the Tang and Song dynasties, urban planners developed complex sewer networks and public latrines. Human waste was often collected and reused as fertilizer, a practice sometimes more organized and widespread than in Europe. In addition, Chinese citizens used a variety of tools for personal hygiene, including water, sponges, and specialized sticks. These practices highlight a practical understanding of waste management long before modern science. Japan had its own unique approach. Samurai and peasants alike used squat toilets, often built over pits, with human waste collected for use as fertilizer. Hygiene practices were influenced by Shinto beliefs, which emphasized cleanliness and ritual purification. Even small villages incorporated practical sanitation measures, showing a cultural connection between spiritual cleanliness and physical hygiene. Back in Europe, sanitation varied widely between regions. Northern European towns relied heavily on open ditches, rivers, and cesspits, while Mediterranean cities sometimes adopted more sophisticated systems influenced by Roman aqueducts and baths. Despite differences in infrastructure, European cities shared common challenges: population density, the smell of waste, and the spread of disease. Solutions were often ingenious, but limited, relying on labor, water flow, and social norms to manage waste. Interestingly, cross-cultural comparisons reveal both convergent and divergent strategies. Everywhere, human societies recognize the importance of separating waste from living spaces, yet the methods varied. Some relied on sophisticated plumbing, others on social norms, superstition, or labor-intensive systems. Climate, geography, and religious beliefs heavily influenced design and usage. For instance, regions with plentiful water could flush waste more easily, while arid areas relied on dry collection methods and composting. Cultural attitudes also shaped toilet etiquette. In some parts of Asia, ritual purification before and after using the toilet was strictly observed, while in Europe, etiquette focused on modesty, privacy, and social hierarchy. Humor, superstition, and social rules were common everywhere, highlighting a universal human need to manage waste while maintaining dignity and safety. Finally, the comparison shows that medieval Europeans were not alone in facing sanitation challenges, nor were they the most primitive. Across continents, people found creative ways to cope with the unavoidable, whether through advanced plumbing, communal rituals, fertilizer recycling, or clever toilet design. Human ingenuity in managing waste has always been remarkable. In conclusion, comparing East and West reveals a rich tapestry of toilet practices, each shaped by environment, culture, and belief. From the hammams of Baghdad to the latrines of Paris, from Chinese sewer networks to Japanese squat toilets, medieval societies found diverse solutions to the same basic problem: how to go to the bathroom with dignity, safety, and sometimes even style. In the next and final chapter, we'll explore how medieval toilet practices evolved into modern sanitation, showing the legacy of these ancient solutions and what we can learn from history's most overlooked infrastructure. After exploring castles, villages, cities, bathhouses, chamber pots, smells, superstitions, and cross-cultural practices, it's time to ask, what happened next? How did the medieval toilet evolve into the modern sanitation systems we take for granted today? The journey from cesspits to flushing toilets is a fascinating story of human ingenuity, trial and error, and gradual technological progress. In the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, urbanization created new pressures. Cities grew denser, populations swelled, and traditional waste management opened ditches, rivers, and cesspits became increasingly dangerous and unsustainable. Disease outbreaks, particularly cholera and plague, highlighted the urgent need for better sanitation. Governments and city planners began to experiment with drainage systems, public latrines, and waste management laws, laying the foundation for modern infrastructure. One notable innovation was the transition from simple pits to connected sewer networks. Medieval European engineers borrowed ideas from Roman aqueducts and sewage systems, sometimes restoring ancient channels to carry waste away from densely populated areas. Cities like London and Paris began to implement rudimentary underground drains, though full-scale sewers remained limited until the 19th century. These early innovations show that the Middle Ages were not as primitive as often imagined. People were observing problems, experimenting with solutions, and learning from failures. Meanwhile, chamber pots and garderobes persisted, but new ideas emerged. The concept of flushing waste with water was being explored. In England, Sir John Harrington, godson of Queen Elizabeth I, invented a flushing toilet in 1596, a device that, while not widely adopted at first, planted the seeds for modern plumbing. Over time, toilets became more sophisticated, incorporating valves, traps, and siphons to improve hygiene and reduce odors, transforming the private bathroom into a more comfortable and sanitary space. Modern sanitation owes much to the lessons of the medieval period. The importance of waste separation, drainage, and labour for a waste management carried forward into contemporary urban planning. Night soil collectors, while replaced by sewage workers, demonstrated the necessity of organised sanitation labour. The use of waste as fertiliser continued in agriculture for centuries, a practice that remains relevant in sustainable farming today. Cultural lessons also endured. The medieval emphasis on privacy, etiquette, and hygiene influenced modern bathroom design. Bathrooms became private, enclosed spaces with attention to comfort and modesty. Public toilets, evolving from communal benches and river latrines, now incorporate plumbing, sanitation standards, and facilities that respect both privacy and health. Even humour and cultural commentary around toilets persisted, reminding us that bathroom life is both practical and social, a universal aspect of human existence. Interestingly, some medieval solutions still resonate today. Dry composting toilets, waste recycling, and even simple ventilation systems echo the ingenuity of garderobes, latrines, and chamber pots. While we've advanced technologically, the fundamental challenge managing human waste efficiently, safely, and respectfully remains the same. The Middle Ages may seem distant, but the echoes of their sanitation strategies are still present in our homes, cities, and agricultural practices. Finally, studying medieval toilets teaches us more than just historical trivia. It reveals the intersection of technology, society, health, and culture. Toilets weren't just functional, they were social spaces, status symbols, sites of humour and superstition, and reflections of human creativity in the face of necessity. From moats and cesspits to flushing toilets and modern sewage systems, the story of sanitation is a story of human resilience, adaptation, and innovation. In conclusion, medieval toilets may have smelled, been awkward, or downright funny, but they paved the way for modern sanitation. By studying the past from castle garderobes to public latrines, from chamber pots to night soil collectors, we gain a deeper appreciation for the everyday technologies that shape our lives. The next time you flush a toilet, wash your hands, or step into a bathroom, remember, you're participating in a centuries-long tradition of problem-solving, hygiene, and ingenuity that started with humans trying to survive and stay clean in a smelly, complex, and fascinating medieval world.